In this video, we're going to talk about setting up user ID on a Palo Alto firewall. Now, user ID can be used in a lot of different ways. Probably one of the most popular ones is to have different groups in your organization that can have access to different areas. So for instance, maybe I have the accounting group. And so the accounting group should be able to have access to certain accounting and finance websites that maybe other people in the organization don't need access to. Or maybe I have some facilities workers or dock workers or something like that, where they don't necessarily need a whole lot of access to a lot of resources. What I could do then is I could then create a security profile that limits them to only a minimal set of web pages. And then lastly, maybe I have IT or some other technology workers where they may, as their job demands, may require them to access resources that may not necessarily be the most secure resources for them to use, but there's other content on those pages that they need access to. So maybe you can specify them to have all access. So along with granting access and denying access based on groups, user ID further helps us to be able to secure our environment. For instance, say I look through the logs on my firewall and I see a lot of virus warnings. Somebody is trying to download a virus on my web page or on my clients, but by default, all it gives me is an IP address. Well, tracking down an IP address in a large business environment can be fairly difficult. The IP address may be sufficient to tell you what floor of a building something's in, the client is in, but actually identifying that client inside the environment could be fairly questionable. But if user ID is enabled, that IP address can be translated to a user, at which point I can then quickly and easily find out what seat that person's in order to track them down and figure out why their machine is trying to access a virus or trying to download it over and over. If it's happening frequently, it's probably not them intentionally doing it. It's probably some other malicious activity that's happening on their machine, and therefore I can prevent the user from hurting the rest of the company before anything bad happens. All right, so on to user ID. So there's a couple of steps we need to do for user ID. The first thing we need to do is we need to look at how our Palo Alto firewall works, specifically with how it works on the management VLAN. By default, the Palo Alto tries to send all of its administrative activities outside the management VLAN. So when it is trying to download updates, when it's trying to get access to the admin page, or anything else that it might need to do, it mostly goes through the management VLAN, and this includes talking to domain controllers. So by default, the Palo Alto tries to talk to the domain controllers out the management VLAN, but if we look at our network diagram here, the management VLAN is not connected to our private VLAN. And since our private VLAN holds our domain controller right here, then when we start trying to do user ID and trying to get the ID from the domain controllers, that's just not gonna work. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to change the way that we talk to our domain controllers, and we're going to have to tell it to use this interface as opposed to the management VLAN interface. So let's go ahead and get started with that. So we've got our firewall right here, just basic security policies. If you're following along, I previously did one where we accessed Facebook, so I did Facebook. I added in a couple other policies since last we talked, just to get rid of some of the errors that was popping up. But first thing we want to do is, well, first off, let's configure the domain name. So we want to configure the domain name so it looks appropriate for our firewall, or for our domain. So under device setup management, I want to, under general settings here, I want to configure the domain name. Right now my domain name is just it340.lab, but that's not the correct domain name. My correct domain name is actually group60.it340.local. Your domain name, of course, will vary. I seriously doubt you have the same one as I do. Above and beyond that, now we want to configure what's called the service route configuration, and that is same area under device, setup, and then this time the services subtab. Down here at the bottom we have service route configuration, and when I click on that, we see that it defaults to using the management interface for all network traffic, for all of our management network traffic, and we don't want to do that for our Active Directory stuff. So I'm going to click Customize, and here we have a large list of various management traffic types that might be happening in our environment, and we want to change for LDAP. So I'm just going to click LDAP here. It pops up another window. Under Select Interface, I'm going to select Ethernet 1.1 because I know that's my private network interface. So I select that, and then I see the source IP address has reflected to that IP as well. So I'll say OK, and while I'm here, along with LDAP, I also want to set up the user ID agent, the UID agent right here. Same thing, just go ahead and change that to the same internal or private interface right there. Go ahead and say OK. All right, so that's the pre-configuration work. Now let's go back to our slides here. These steps that we have here is we start off like we just did, configuring the domain name so that the domain name matches what our Active Directory domain name is. We just configured service route configuration. Next step is create an LDAP server profile. Active Directory utilizes a protocol called LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. And so we need to configure that on our firewall in order to work in our environment. So we are close there already. So we're still under device. And then on the left-hand side, let's go ahead and scroll on down. We have server profiles, and there is an LDAP profile here. This is where we want to set our LDAP profile. We haven't set anything up previously, so obviously it's going to be blank. I'll go ahead and say add. Let's give this a friendly name. Let's call this group 60. Sure, because my domain is group 60. And then under server list, I want to add. And here I can give this a name. It can be a friendly name, for instance, DC1. And then the IP address of the LDAP server. In my case, that is 10.1.0.100. Let me actually look at my domain controller first before I confirm that. 10.1.0.100, yes, okay. Port 389, that is the correct port I want to use. We could also, depending on our environment, we could use 636. This is the SSL version of LDAP. What that then comes down to is we then have to choose whether we want to use SSL or not. 389 is not SSL, which means I want to clear that out right there. So let's go ahead and uncheck require SSL while we're at it. Under server settings, the type we want to specify is Active Directory. There's lots of different LDAP types. Active Directory is the one that we want. Based in, if I click the drop down arrow here, it's not going to work. So I have to actually type this in. The domains are written kind of backwards. Let's see, DC equals group, oops, DC equals group 60, comma, DC equals IT340, comma, DC equals local. So basically, as my domain, my fully qualified domain name is group60.it340.local, just put DCs and commas in between all of those. For the bind DN, I'm going to go ahead and type in my domain name. So it's administrator, oops, administrator at group60.it340.local. In this case, I want this bind DN to be in the form of an email address. It's called a UPN, or a universal something naming. Oh man, I forget exactly what UPN is, but I want it to be in this email format of username at domain. Password super secret password 01. And at that point, we should be able to say OK and commit this. So the commit is making a couple of changes here. Remember, it's making the it's adding the LDAP server as well as configuring the service route configuration and domain name. All right, just to be sure, I'm going to go back in here. And at this point, because the service route configuration and the LDAP server is set up, I should be able to click here where it says base DN. Should be able to click the drop down. And there we go. I see it right there. And that means it has actually queried the domain controller and is fully correct. I'm going to choose the one it gave me just because it's capitalized and looks a little bit better. While we're at it, the next thing I want to do is I also want to further confirm that this is working. And so I'm going to go to, still under device, I'm going to go to user identification. And here under the group mapping settings page, I'm just going to click add. For right now, we'll leave the name blank because we're not actually going to save this, but I will select my server profile, which I just created, group 60. And then under group include list, I'm going to click this, this arrow right here to branch it out. And I just want to see if something shows up. And right there, I can see it gave me invalid credentials. It gave me an error. So that means I typed something wrong. I typed in a username or a password incorrect. So that's why I wanted to check this, was to confirm that that was working. And it's not. So, ldap. There we go. So try that one more time. Admin. Ooh, I did a typo right there. Administrator. I'm assuming the password is correct, but I'll type it in again just to be sure. And OK, and commit. All right, that's closed. Now let's go back to user identification. Same thing, group mapping, add, specify our server, and then group include list. And there we go. It branched out, which told me I logged into my Active Directory domain controller. It queried the LDAP profiles and is showing me group information. Awesome. All right, so next thing is under the user information. Oh, user mappings tab. That's where I want to go. Have to make sure I'm looking in the right place here. Under the user mappings tab, we have this Palo Alto Networks user ID agent setup section. And there's a couple of checkboxes here, such as enabling session and enabling probing. Now you can read online, there's lots of details about what these mean. Session, I believe, will follow the session for the user, and then probing will probe every 20 minutes or so to make sure that the credentials are still correct. So what I want to do is I want to turn those on. To do that, I'm going to click this gear icon in the upper right hand corner. First off, under WMI authentication, I have to type in, again, my administrator credentials. This time I type it in differently than what we did before. This time I have to do domain name /administrator and then password 01. Now, if this was a real production environment, what I would do is on the domain, I would actually create a user account called maybe Palo Alto user ID. And I would create that account in my domain and then give them credentials so that I can then have a specific user that's performing this one service for me. Because I haven't done that, because this is a test lab, I'm staying with administrator. Next, under the server monitor tab, we want to enable sessions for the server monitor. And then under the client probing tab, we want to enable probing. I'm not going to worry about the probing interval or really anything else on this. There's lots of information about how to track that down and what they all mean. I will leave that to you to research. All right. Further down on the user mapping list here, we have our server monitoring section, and this is how we are able to monitor our servers. So I'm going to click add, and here we can call this anything we want here. We can call this say group 60 DC1. It is an Active Directory, and then our IP address 10.1.0.100, and OK. And then lastly, now we can go back to our group mapping settings where we started off a couple of minutes ago. So right up here, group mapping settings. And now we want to add in the groups that we want. So let's call this group 60 groups, user groups. Same thing, server profile, specify that. And then under the group include list, let's go ahead and branch that out and show all of the groups, which are all under users. In this case, I want to add domain admins and domain users. And I also want IT users. Basically what we're doing here is we're selecting all the groups we might want to filter on in the future. So for my initial example, I might want to have a group in here called accounting. So if I would find the accounting group over here and then move them over here so that I can then later filter on the accounting group. Same thing with facilities. Facilities, however we spell that, and my IT users that I just created. And maybe I have an executives so that I can then apply QoS policies to the executives and whoever else I might have in my organization. So the included groups is what allows me to filter and act on right there. So, okay. And then let's see. Let's actually look at my list here. So we created the LDAP server profile. Check. Excuse me. Check. We created the authentication profile. That was when we went in and created enabled pooling, polling, and WMI, and we just set up our group mappings. Next step is to enable user ID on a specific zone. We don't necessarily want to check user account credentials for every single zone out there. We only want to check that on, say, our inside zone. So let's go to our zone and enable user ID mapping. Let's see, so zones, that's under network. Zones, hey, I'm already there. We want the private zone. And right up here on the right, upper right hand side, I see this little checkbox, enable user identification. This is what tells it, hey, for the private zone, try to track down who's logging in, who's accessing the web page through me. So we'll say okay, and then finally we'll go ahead and commit. So we will commit all of these changes. We have configured the domain name so that we can, so that we know exactly which domain name we're looking at. We have configured service route configuration so that the network traffic, the domain traffic, is going out the right interface into our private network as opposed to straight out of our management network. We created an LDAP server profile so that we can then talk to our domain controller. We gave it the right IP address and configured it appropriately. Created the authentication profile along with the WMI and polling, and then specified groups that we want to map. Finally, we went into our private zone and enabled user ID. Now, we just need to confirm it. let's see. So our commit status completed. Let's go to a client. So I've got a client PC right here. Let's go ahead and log in. And let's start browsing the internet. Now, what pages we hit doesn't really matter. Let's, there we go. Just click a couple of pages here, see what's happening. All right, that should be enough. And then we come back to our Palo Alto, and under the monitoring tab, traffic, and it's showing up here, and we can see right here we have the source user column, and it now shows the domain/username. So here it's showing this user is accessing this rule and has been allowed. So permit private access. I can actually click on this little pop-up right here, or this magnifying glass, give me more details about it, about what rules being hit, which web pages I'm going to. There we go. Destination, destination IP address, port, the NATed IP, and so on. So there we go. We were able to see exactly who's accessing this website. So now when we're looking through our event logs and we're seeing, hey, a whole bunch of people are accessing gambling sites. Now we can then evaluate and find out exactly who is seeing those gambling sites. Along with that, we can now start customizing our policies. So for instance, under policies, let's go ahead and create a new one. And let's call this one Block IT. My user account that we were just looking at is actually a member of the IT domain group. So we're going to create a policy that will block the IT domain group. In order to do this, let's start off exactly the same way we would do everything before with security policies. Start off with source. The source zone would be private. Destination zone is public. Application, by default, any is selected. That's perfectly fine in this case. I could specify which applications I want to permit or block. In this case, just as an example, I'm going to block everything. Service categories, we'll leave that. Under actions, I want action setting to be changed to deny. And because we're denying, the sessions rarely end, we actually want to log them at the start. So right now this will block everybody who hits this rule. What we want to do is we want to come up here to the user tab that we glanced over very quickly previously, but now we're actually going to start throwing that in. Under the user tab, I'll click add, and it shows me the groups that I had selected in my group mappings. I said I wanted to block IT users, so we'll put IT users in there, and then we'll say OK. And before we commit it, one thing we have to remember about firewalls is that the firewalls work from the top down. So if we look at this, we have a permit, and then finally a block. So if we're going from the top down, we're not coming from the DMZ, so that one's not going to apply, but we are coming from private. So that means rule number 2, we will hit first and we will be allowed. In which case, we will never hit rule number 3 and be denied. So what we have to do is we have to take rule number 3 here and move it up to the top. So it is the very first one in the order here, or at least above rule number 2, so that the IT users are blocked prior to being allowed. So to do that, I'm just going to click in IT3, highlight it, click and drag, and then move it up here to rule number 1. So now rule number 1 is block IT. So if somebody comes in and they are a member of IT users in the private zone, and they're going to the public zone, then all the way over here on the right hand side, they will be denied access. So let's go ahead and commit that. And as soon as that commit is complete, we will bounce back to our workstation and try accessing the IT user, or the internet as an IT user. There we go. So let's try yahoo.com. And we see that the little wheel up here is just spinning, 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 waiting on response. If we go msn.com, spinning, spinning, spinning. Anywhere, youtube.com, anywhere that we're trying to go to is spinning, not just because web browsing is blocked, but because DNS is blocked, ping is blocked, everything is blocked. We can't get anywhere because it's identifying us as the IT group and not allowing us in, or not allowing us out. If we look back at our logs here on the firewall, see monitor, logs, should be refreshing here. Here we go. Source is user group 60/edcode, trying to go from private to public, and we see that the type is drop. It is actively denying our access due to the rule called block IT. So there you have it. Now we can start changing our policies of allowing certain people through to some things, other people not to other things, changing quality of service profiles, changing antivirus profiles, changing whatever we might need in our environment, all thanks to user ID and our ability to be able to identify who's in our environment and what are they accessing.